Breaking news, Ellen DeGeneres is a big... What? What? Yeah.
I don't know if anyone else remembers this, but one of the first Ellen moments that really made me stop and think happened back in 2008, when Mariah Carey appeared on the Ellen DeGeneres show. At the time, it looked like a pretty normal daytime TV interview. Ellen brought up the rumors that Mariah was pregnant, and Mariah immediately made it clear that she didn't want to talk about it.
People are saying that that you're pregnant. There's rumors.
Don't discuss that.
And honestly, that should have been the end of it. But Ellen kept going. She brought out champagne and joked that if Mariah wasn't pregnant, she should be able to have a drink. Mariah laughed, but she also looked visibly uncomfortable, even saying,
I can't believe you did this to me, Ellen.
What?
And the audience laughed along. Back then, it was easy to watch that moment as just Ellen being playful and putting a celebrity on the spot. But years later, it started to feel very different. Mariah eventually spoke about how uncomfortable she had been during the interview, and in 2020, she told Vulture that she had a hard time dealing with the experience. And there's another detail that makes the footage even harder to watch. Mariah later suffered a miscarriage. I'm not suggesting Ellen had anything to do with that, she didn't, but knowing what Mariah went through makes the decision to turn such a private subject into a joke feel even more uncomfortable. And that's when I started wondering, how did someone who built an entire career around kindness have moments like this? But if I'm gonna understand why that moment bothered me so much, I think I have to go back a little further. Because Ellen didn't start her career as this universally loved, endlessly positive talk show host. She started as a comedian. She worked her way through comedy clubs, eventually getting into television and landing her own sitcom. Then, in 1997, she made a decision that completely changed the direction of her career. She came out publicly, and her character on Ellen came out too. At the time, that was a huge deal. Ellen was one of the biggest names on television to do something like that, and while she had plenty of support, her career suddenly became much harder to maintain. Ellen was canceled in 1998, another sitcom attempt didn't work, and for a few years, Ellen basically disappeared from the center of Hollywood. She has talked about how difficult it was to find work during that period, and honestly, it looked like her career might never recover. Then 2003 happened. Ellen was cast as the voice of Dory in Finding Nemo, and somehow the role fit her perfectly. Dory was funny, energetic, optimistic, and completely impossible not to like. The movie became a huge success, and suddenly Ellen had a completely different relationship with the public. The role didn't just bring Ellen back into the spotlight, it reminded audiences why they had liked her in the first place, introduced her to an entirely new audience, and helped reignite Hollywood's interest in her. And that same year, on September 8th, 2003, The Ellen DeGeneres Show premiered. And looking at that transition now, I think this is where the story gets really interesting. Because Ellen wasn't just making a comeback, she was becoming a completely different kind of celebrity. She had found the version of Ellen that millions of people were going to fall in love with. And when The Ellen DeGeneres Show started, I don't think anyone could have predicted just how perfectly Ellen understood what audiences wanted from daytime television. Everything about the show felt positive. There was the dancing, the celebrity interviews, the audience games, Ellen giving away cars, money, and vacations. She'd bring ordinary people onto the show and suddenly make them feel like the most important person in the room. And then there were the surprises. One of the most memorable was the Cheerios giveaway, where Ellen revealed that the audience would be sharing a $1 million prize. Moments like that became part of what people expected from the show. And it wasn't just about giving things away. Ellen built this entire atmosphere around being generous, funny, and harmless. She could make fun of celebrities one minute and then turn around and surprise someone with something life-changing the next. At the end of almost every episode came the same message: be kind to one another. And after hearing that for years, it stopped sounding like a catchphrase. It became Ellen's identity. The show lasted for almost 20 years, reached millions of viewers, and collected more than 80 Emmy Awards. Ellen's presence on social media became enormous too, with clips from the show constantly circulating online. And I think that's why the image became so powerful. People weren't just watching a talk show host, they were watching the person who was supposed to be the nice one. The celebrity who gave things away, the celebrity who made people laugh, the celebrity who supposedly wanted everyone around her to feel good. And honestly, that's what makes everything that happened later so strange, because Ellen wasn't just hosting a talk show. She had turned kindness into her entire identity. When people talk about the Ellen controversy, 2020 is usually where the story begins. That's when the allegations became impossible to ignore. But some of the earlier warning signs go back much further. Take the 2007 Writers Guild strike. Ellen crossed the picket line while the strike was happening, which immediately created controversy around the show. Her reasoning was that she didn't want her staff to lose work, but critics argued that continuing to produce the show also meant continuing to profit while writers were on strike. On its own, I don't think this proves anything about Ellen's personality. There were arguments on both sides, and the situation was more complicated than simply saying Ellen was the bad guy. What caught my attention more was what came later. Former people who worked around the show began describing a difference between the Ellen they saw when the cameras were rolling and the Ellen they experienced when they weren't. One former writer described watching Ellen charm everyone during rehearsals, only for her demeanor to change as soon as the director yelled cut. She claimed Ellen would glare at the writers and question why they kept writing quote-unquote unfunny jokes. And that distinction started becoming important, because the version of Ellen audiences knew was warm, funny, and completely in control of the room. But according to some of these accounts, that wasn't necessarily the version people experienced behind the scenes. And at the time, nobody really had a reason to connect those stories to anything bigger. The show was successful, Ellen was successful, and the public image was still almost impossible to crack. So I don't think the 2007 strike was some secret preview of everything that would happen 13 years later. It wasn't. But looking back, it does make one thing clear. The stories didn't suddenly appear in 2020. There had been questions around Ellen for years. They just weren't powerful enough to overcome the image she'd built, because the kindness machine was simply too powerful. And this is where I started noticing something else, because Ellen's humor was often built around making other people the joke. Most of the time, it was easy to laugh along with it. That's what daytime television is supposed to do. But every now and then, I'd watch one of these moments and think, wait, is this actually funny, or is this just someone being put in an uncomfortable position? Take the translator. Ellen was interviewing a guest through a translator, and instead of simply letting the conversation happen, she kept interrupting the translator and joking about the translation itself.
Oh, acoustic. Well, don't just ask him. Don't look at me and go, I don't know. We're not having a conversation. I'm asking him, what is a finger style?
Maybe the intention was to make the segment funny. But watching it back, I couldn't help wondering who the joke was actually for. Then there was the Ellen gift shop incident. The audience had been told they could take one item from the show's gift shop. Hidden cameras were used to catch people who took more than they were supposed to. One woman apparently took an extra item for her sister, and Ellen singled her out when the footage was shown. Ellen told her to go sit in quote-unquote Ellen jail and framed it as a lesson about being a good person. Everyone laughed. And maybe in the moment it really was supposed to be harmless, but there's something strange about watching a celebrity with that much power publicly embarrass an ordinary person who is sitting in the audience because they were excited to be on our show. And if you're enjoying this deep dive so far, make sure you subscribe to the channel because we're only getting started. Then there was the painting. A fan created a portrait of Ellen and Portia and sent it to the show as a genuine gesture. Instead of simply thanking her, Ellen turned the artwork into a joke. Again, none of these moments by themselves prove that Ellen was secretly a terrible person. That's not what I'm saying. What bothered me was the pattern. The translator, the audience member, the fan, different people, completely different situations, but the same basic dynamic. Ellen had the power, and someone else became the punchline. And eventually I had to ask myself, at what point does saying, "I'm just joking," stop explaining the behavior? And this is where I think the whole thing became a little more interesting, because it's one thing when an audience member gets embarrassed on a talk show. It's another when the person sitting across from Ellen is a celebrity who has enough status to actually push back. Take Taylor Swift. Ellen repeatedly turned Taylor's dating life into a source of entertainment, even when Taylor clearly wasn't comfortable discussing it. The jokes kept coming, the questions kept coming, and Taylor eventually made it pretty obvious that she didn't want to play along. And that's the part that stuck with me, because when you're sitting on Ellen's couch, you're technically a guest, but Ellen controls the questions, the edit, the audience reaction, and the entire tone of the segment. And the more I looked at these interviews, the more that power dynamic stood out to me. Ricky Gervais was another interesting case. During a trivia segment, Ricky ended up outperforming Ellen, answering the questions more accurately while she struggled to keep up. Instead of simply becoming another funny celebrity moment, her reaction became part of the joke itself. It was one of those situations where you could see how much the dynamic changed when the person across from Ellen wasn't simply going to play along with whatever she set up. But the moment that really stayed with me happened with Dakota Johnson in 2019. Ellen brought up Dakota's birthday and jokingly complained that she hadn't been invited, except Dakota immediately corrected her.
How was the party? I wasn't invited.
Actually, no, that's not the truth, Ellen. You were invited.
She had invited Ellen. Ellen had simply forgotten. And suddenly, something that would normally have been another Ellen joke had completely flipped.
Well, who doesn't want to be invited to a party?
Well, I didn't even know you liked me.
Of course I like you. You knew I liked you.
Dakota wasn't embarrassed. She wasn't backing down. She was looking directly at Ellen and telling her that what she was saying wasn't true. And I think that's why the moment became so memorable. Because Ellen was used to controlling the joke. She could tease the guest, make the audience laugh, and move on to the next question. But this time, the person sitting across from her wasn't accepting the premise. And suddenly, Ellen wasn't the one controlling the joke anymore. And by this point, I wasn't the only person noticing it. Throughout the late 2010s, clips of Ellen's most uncomfortable moments started circulating online. People were putting together compilations, dissecting old interviews, and talking about what Ellen was like when the cameras weren't rolling. Then, in 2018, the New York Times published a piece titled, "Ellen DeGeneres is not as nice as you think." And that title alone tells you how much the conversation had changed, because the criticism wasn't really about one joke anymore. People were starting to question the entire personality Ellen had built her career around. Former writers and employees began sharing stories about the difference between Ellen on camera and Ellen behind the scenes. Then, in 2020, comedian Kevin Porter posted a tweet asking people to share their craziest stories about Ellen. What followed wasn't just a handful of replies. People began sharing their own experiences, including stories from fans and people who had interacted with the show, and the thread quickly became part of the larger conversation around Ellen. People started coming forward with stories about interactions with Ellen, including claims that she would ignore people when the cameras weren't rolling, treat staff differently depending on their position, and behave very differently from the person viewers saw every afternoon. Now, obviously, I don't think every anonymous story posted online should automatically be treated as fact, but the sheer volume of these stories made them harder for me to simply dismiss. Because when you have one uncomfortable interview, you can explain it away. A second one might just be a bad day. But when thousands of people start telling variations of the same story, it becomes harder to dismiss as coincidence. And that's when the Ellen conversation stopped being about whether she was occasionally mean. People were starting to ask a much bigger question. What was actually happening behind the cameras? And then 2020 happened. By this point, the clips and stories online had created this growing suspicion around Ellen. But there was still a huge difference between people saying, "I don't like her," and actually accusing her workplace of being toxic. That changed on July 17, 2020, when BuzzFeed News published a report based on interviews with one current employee and 10 former employees of the Ellen DeGeneres show. And suddenly, we weren't talking about awkward celebrity interviews anymore. Employees described a workplace where they allegedly experienced racism, favoritism, and a culture where people were afraid to speak up. Some claim they were punished or treated badly for raising concerns, while others described an environment where employees felt they had to be extremely careful about what they said and who they said it to. And one of the accounts that really stood out to me came from Hannah Muscat, who had worked on the show from its launch in 2003. According to her account, employees were essentially told not to approach Ellen directly. She described people feeling like they were walking on eggshells. She also described executive producer Ed Glavin as someone who could yell at staff while Ellen allegedly watched it happen. Her description of the dynamic was pretty brutal. She said, "Every production needs their dog." And that's when the whole story started to feel different to me. Because these weren't people complaining about a bad interview. These were people talking about their workplace. And then COVID made everything even harder to ignore. The pandemic had already made the gap between ordinary people and wealthy celebrities impossible to ignore. Then Ellen made the infamous joke about being in prison during lockdown while filming from her massive mansion.
This is like being in jail, is what it is. It's mostly because I've been wearing the same clothes for 10 days and everyone in here is gay.
She was obviously trying to make a joke about being stuck at home, but the audience didn't hear it that way. People were struggling with jobs, money, and uncertainty, while Ellen was sitting inside a mansion comparing quarantine to prison. And for me, that's when even the harmless jokes started carrying a completely different weight. The problem wasn't simply that people thought Ellen could be mean. Now the question was whether the workplace behind the kindness brand actually reflected the values Ellen had spent years selling to the public. And this is where I think Ellen's response becomes almost as important as the allegations themselves. Ellen's position was basically that she didn't know what was happening inside her own workplace. She pointed out that the show had around 255 employees spread across different departments and multiple buildings. She said she had delegated a lot of the day-to-day management, and if people were being mistreated, someone should have told her. And to be fair, I don't think it's reasonable to assume Ellen personally ordered every single thing that employees complained about. That's not what the allegations established. But I still couldn't get past one question. How much responsibility can you actually delegate when your name is on the show, the brand, and practically everything surrounding it? Because this wasn't some random company that Ellen happened to work for. It was the Ellen DeGeneres show. The entire business was built around her personality. Warner Media eventually investigated the workplace, and 3 senior executives were fired as a result of the fallout. Ellen also apologized to her employees, acknowledging that the stories being told about the workplace were not consistent with the environment she wanted to create. She apologized publicly too. But by then, something had already changed. People weren't simply asking whether Ellen knew about every individual incident. They were asking how much responsibility the face of a brand built around kindness should have for the culture inside that brand. And I think that's the fairest way to look at it. Ellen didn't have to personally order every action for the question of leadership to matter. And once all of this happened, the consequences were pretty much impossible to separate from Ellen's image. When season 18 came back, the show was under an entirely different kind of scrutiny. People weren't just watching the guests anymore. They were watching Ellen, waiting to see whether the person on screen matched everything they had been hearing about the person behind it. And the audience started disappearing. According to the source transcript, the show lost more than 1 million viewers, and the ratings continued failing as the season went on. Then, in May 2021, Ellen announced that season 19 would be the final season. The show eventually ended in 2022. But I don't think the most important thing here is the ratings, because television shows lose viewers all the time. What made Ellen's situation different was what the audience was losing faith in. If Ellen had built her career around being controversial, rude, or unpredictable, another scandal might have been survivable. But she hadn't. She had spent almost 20 years telling people that kindness was the whole point. So once people stopped believing in that, they weren't just losing interest in the show, they were losing faith in the person they were watching. And for a brand built entirely around one person's personality, that's a much bigger problem than losing ratings. But there was another part of this story that kept coming back to me. What did Ellen actually seem like to the people who weren't there as guests? One example comes from Donna D'Amadio, who attended the show in 2018. She had flown all the way from Chicago to Los Angeles because she was a huge Ellen fan and was genuinely excited about the chance to see her in person. But according to D'Amadio, producers gave her a strange warning before the show even started.
They tell you, you can't be smarter, funnier than Ellen. She's the comedian and the star, not you.
D'Amadio said Ellen was warm and engaging with the audience while the cameras were rolling, but once filming stopped, that interaction supposedly disappeared.
She would only speak to the audience when the cameras were rolling. As soon as they turned the cameras off, she would not even acknowledge the audience. She would just sit on the couch, basically.
Now, again, that's one person's account. I'm not going to pretend a single fan experience proves everything, but that's exactly why it matters in the context of everything else. Because we've now heard versions of this same basic contradiction from different directions. The Ellen people saw on television and the Ellen some people say they experienced when the cameras weren't rolling. And after everything that happened in 2020, those two versions became much harder to separate. Because once you start questioning what happens when the cameras stop, even the moments you once thought were harmless start looking a little different. After going through all of this, I don't think the ugly truth about Ellen is that she was secretly some terrible person hiding behind a fake smile. Honestly, that's way too simple. What I think is more interesting is what happens when your personality becomes the product. Ellen wasn't just selling celebrity interviews or daytime entertainment, she was selling a version of herself. Kindness, generosity, happiness, authenticity. And eventually, be kind to one another became almost inseparable from her name. So, when employees, fans, and other people who had interacted with her started describing experiences that seemed completely different from that image, the problem wasn't just another celebrity scandal. It attacked the product itself. And then, in 2024, Ellen released For Your Approval, where she reflected on what happened after the show ended.
Got a talk show, and I ended the show every day by saying, be kind to one another. Had I ended my show by saying, go f*** yourselves,
She joked about the fact that she used to finish every episode by telling people to be kind to one another, talked about wanting people to like her, and even addressed the money and fame that came with her career. And watching that after everything that happened, I couldn't help thinking about how strange the whole journey had become. Because the woman who spent almost 20 years telling everyone to be kind was now having to explain what happened when people stopped believing her. Maybe Ellen's biggest mistake wasn't proving that she wasn't perfect. It was building an empire around the idea that she was. If you enjoyed this, subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the stories behind the celebrities we think we know.